Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to those of you in the Lightfoot room as well. You can hear us. I hope you can see us as well. Let me introduce myself. I'm Bob White. I'm Director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, and this is one of the termly lectures we have, which is organised by Christians in Science and the Faraday. And we're delighted with our speaker tonight. I'll tell you about him in a minute. I'm pretty certain there is no fire alarm test expected this evening. So should the fire alarm go off, I think we'd better leave. And there are exits front and back. And I'm sure people will direct you if that happens. But I'm also pretty sure it probably won't happen. So thank you very much for coming. Let me tell you something about our speaker tonight. He's the Most Reverend Dr. Rowan Williams. I think that's his proper title. And he's currently Master of Magdalen College here in Cambridge. But when I looked at his CV, I see he's spent his life bouncing between Oxford and Cambridge, not both at the same time. So he did his undergraduate degree here at Christ College in Cambridge, and then he did a PhD in Oxford at Christ Church and Wadham there, just to balance the two out. And then he came back and was a tutor at Westcott House here in Cambridge, and a lecturer in divinity, in the Faculty of Divinity, and Dean of Clare College as well. And then he went back to Oxford for 6 years as Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity. And then, as you know, he's back in Cambridge now as Master of Magdalen College. So he's had a very distinguished career academically in, of course, the two best places in Britain, or maybe in the world. But he did some other little jobs in between, which you may have heard about. So one of them was, of course, Archbishop of Canterbury. So he's had a lot of experience in both pastoral work and in academic work. I won't read out all the honorary degrees he's got, or honorary doctorates, indeed, from more than a dozen other universities. But the thing I was most amazed at, he speaks his native Welsh, and he speaks reads 9 other foreign languages as well. And I presume English is one of those foreign languages. Yeah, well, maybe, he says. So I'm really impressed by that. So, Rowan, thank you so much for agreeing to speak for us tonight. And you're going to speak on human identity in a scientific world, a really big question with AI and all the other things that bombard us at the moment. So join me in welcoming Rowan.
Thank you very much indeed for your welcome. It's a very great honour, rather intimidating honour, to be invited to give this lecture in front of so distinguished an audience. My title is deliberately rather ambiguous. Human identity in the scientific world could be a question about what makes humans human, in a world where there are all sorts of questions, not only about artificial intelligence, but also about the particular boundary that we might identify between human and animal life. But there's also implied in this a question about human identity as we might understand it in terms of your identity and mine. What is it for us to be subjects or agents rather than simply mechanisms? We live in a culture where it's fairly common for people to assume, for example, in respect of the first question, that what makes humans distinctive is a problem which is not only difficult, but also in some sense question-begging in the way it's phrased. Why should we worry about what makes humans distinctive? We've had several millennia of assuming that human beings are distinctive, and look where it's got us. So maybe it's safer, more ethical, more intellectually respectable, simply to assume that what we say about every other kind of agent or substance in the world simply applies to humans. As Daniel Dennett memorably put it, with typical trenchancy and elegance, there's only one kind of stuff. So, at one end, there's that concern which assumes that there's something that has gone rather wrong in the history of anthropocentrism, or human exceptionalism, the idea that human beings are so different from everything else that the privileges they have in our universe are such as to justify the kind of treatment of the environment that we've seen with such disastrous results for quite a while. But then, of course, the subset of that, which occupies the other end of a particular spectrum, is what is there finally to distinguish us from highly skillful machines? What is there to distinguish human intelligence from artificial intelligence? And if we can successfully reproduce the workings of human intelligence in mechanical form, is there anything left distinctive about human identity? Various kinds of panic, which suggest that we are about to be taken over by robots. That's simply the tip of an iceberg, a rather interesting conceptual iceberg, raising questions about what it is that computers can or can't do. Come back to that later. So, simply within that framing of the question, what is it that makes humans human in a way that is distinctive, has identity? Apart from that question, we have the consequential question of whether we can ever say we are distinctive as agents, whether we have freedom, whether our consciousness is, in some sense, illusory or epiphenomenal, I'm sorry about the long words, whether, in fact, when we think we are doing things, we are actually doing them rather than being done to. There once was a man who said, "Damn, it appears to me that I am an engine that moves in predestinate grooves. I'm not even a bus, I'm a tram," as one significant philosopher once observed. So that's the spread of issues that I think my title opens up. I won't be able to give anything remotely resembling a satisfactory answer to all those large questions, but I'd like to reflect a little bit on where the stresses and the pressures in this area come from in our recent cultural history, and a little bit about what kinds of things from inside and outside the scientific world might give us pause in simply taking for granted that the question was settled and we now could safely stop thinking about it. In terms of the cultural history, there's still, I think, a great deal to be done both on the actual emergence of this sort of language and on the reasons which make it appealing or persuasive to people. Wittgenstein famously observed in the 1930s that it is charming to destroy prejudice. He meant by that we will sometimes be lured into some quite unlikely conclusions simply because it sounds so exciting. It's counterintuitive, it's rather cool, it's rather novel, and so we're inclined to accept a point of view, especially if it overturns what seems like historic prejudice. Belief in freedom or agency or human distinctiveness is obviously an inherited prejudice, and it's quite charming to think otherwise. Various writers in the last half century have addressed this from different points of view. The American novelist Walker Percy, author of a remarkable little book called Lost in the Cosmos, poses rather wistfully the question of why we seem to be so absorbed in whether there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, as if we were incapable of recognizing intelligent life on our own doorsteps. The more we become isolated from one another, says Percy, the more we long wistfully for somebody to emerge from the depths of the cosmos to tell us that we're really here. More recently, Marilyn Robinson's very pungent little book, Absence of Mind, the Terry Lectures at Yale some years ago, raises some of the same questions and again asks that nagging question, why is such a view so appealing? But I want now to begin to open up some of the ways in which we might respond to the problem as I've set it out, both in respect of that general question of what makes humans human and the more specific question of whether we can talk defensibly and intelligibly in a scientific world about agency and identity. And I want to begin with a slightly sideways observation about the things that human beings do. One of the things human beings do is the performance of quite complex sets of processes involving sound, gesture, movement, the production of other artifacts, whose intention is to share a perception of the common environment. We make noises in order to get across to other physical objects something about an environment which is assumed to be shared, directing attention to aspects of that environment which we assume to be of some kind of interest to the other physical object around. It's usually called speech. But that's not the only way in which these practices of drawing attention are manifest. As I say, we gesture, we produce objects which direct, point, indicate, imitate. We're not alone in the animal world in practices of this sort. What is unusual, to avoid any question-begging terms at this point, what is unusual is that the way in which we generate these pointers to features of the environment, in sound or gesture or whatever, becomes something which in turn is available for inspection, reflection, imitation, and representation. That's to say, language and the consciousness that we assume to be at work within it has about it aspects of a feedback loop. What we generate becomes itself an agenda for further activity, in a way which doesn't seem to be the case in the communicative practices of other members of the animal world. We don't know that there is irony among chimpanzees. I'm ready to be surprised. But this is, as I say, simply one of those human practices which is observable in the world. And in the human case, these practices of pointing, gesturing, making noises, indicating, sharing perception are not just about, it seems, a pattern of simple cause and effect, in that similar circumstances, identical circumstances, produce, across the globe, variant languages, quite literally, and even within one culture or one linguistic group, various styles and kinds of representation. So what I'm calling the practice of representation here is in fact a highly diverse and certainly intriguing set of phenomena, suggesting that one of the things which we can reasonably say is characteristic of human animals is a habit of representing, indicating a shared environment with an agenda at work in a way that is both more than merely functional and becomes self-reflexive, that is, it feeds back into its own processes and generates a new agenda. Other animals have calls of recognition, and a very exploratory, delightful, and provoking book, which appeared some 10 years ago, called The Singing Neanderthals. What a name for a rock group. The Singing Neanderthals suggests that human communication begins in music rather than in words. I won't go into the very detailed and intriguing argument behind that, which has to do with evolutionary biology, not just with general considerations of plausibility. But the calls of recognition, the noises which invite other people to respond or resonate, expand, in the human case, into practices that have about them a degree of gratuity, a degree of elaboration beyond what's merely needed for drawing attention. And I labour this point because, of course, it's precisely the scientific disciplines of evolutionary biology and indeed anthropology, historical anthropology, and archaeology that enables to see something of how this practice of noise-making representation originates and develops. It's not as if we're dealing here with a flat assertion about what is distinctively human, with a capital D and a capital H, irrespective of the scientific world. It is, it seems, the scientific world itself which opens out some further and richer dimensions of what the practice of representation actually is and entails. And to pursue this just a little bit further, I spoke of the representational noises and gestures we make as having something to do with the shaping of an environment we recognize as shared. When we make such noises, we make the rather extraordinary assumption that the environment we are drawing attention to is an environment which will be recognizable to the other presence in that environment, which is in itself a remarkable act of trust when you think about it. If in the primitive savannah, the first speaker in a particular situation cannot trust that the other presence there will recognize what he or she means by mammoth, let alone saber-toothed tiger, there are evolutionary consequences. The point again is that within this practice of representing, this practice of gesturing to, evoking an environment, there is already a relational element, already an element which assumes that there is sufficient ground for confidence that another will recognize what is being noised, pointed at, or whatever. And as the noises develop and the practice becomes more sophisticated and more complex, what emerges is, of course, the common activity of building an intellectual framework, picturing, evoking, and eventually prodding and exploring that environment which we share. Once again, it's dangerous to be absolutist about this, but we have very sparing evidence indeed to suggest that the construction of a common culture and a common habit of exploration is to be found other than in the human animal. And in all I've said so far, I'd want to underline the importance of those words, the human animal. We are, of course, animals. Our organic identity is clear enough. That we have a cultural identity as well as an organic one is not to say that we are a totally different kind of stuff, with a tip of the hat to Dennett. It is to say that there are refinements and developments of that cultural practice, that representational practice, which are distinctive in human behavior. So it's not a matter of what other species don't do and we do, more that the way in which humans do things that are fairly common in the animal world is one that has a particular dimension to do, as I said, with feedback, self-reflexivity, and gratuity, which seems to be distinctive to the human animal. There then is a tentative basis for a response to that first way of putting the question, what is it that is distinctive about the human in a scientific world? We can say, on reputable scientific grounds, that there are aspects of our representational practice which we share with the animal world and aspects that we don't. On a continuum of representational practices, there are some things we do and chimps and wombats don't. It's not a lot, but it's a start. I said that I'd come back to the other end of the spectrum, the question of artificial intelligence, in that connection as well. And this is where, of course, it gets notoriously complicated, and where both philosophers and computer scientists find themselves locked in some very, very involved discussions. Computers can win games. We've discovered that they can beat the foremost champions in certain games in the world. We've discovered that their capacity for processing the algorithms necessary to work out a set of consequential alternatives is unparalleled by the human brain. And this leads to a very strong, very prevalent assumption that the computer model is therefore the one which will solve problems in a way which human brains and human intelligence can't or won't. The risk of simply taking this as another dissolution of human identity is, I think, in the assumption that there is essentially only one kind of problem, the kind of problem that can be reduced very rapidly to binary terms and simple algorithms. That seems to me debatable, to say the least. It's also a question whether the way in which artificial intelligence can express a representation of a world is the same thing as what we mean by representation. Apart from the fact that the way representation then occurs is the fruit of a programming of representational practice by other representers, that is us. It comes down to the question that might be expressed in terms of whether clocks know the time, as opposed to telling it. There are other questions, though, about what in human behavior and human linguistic behavior and human representational behavior can't easily at the moment, note the qualification, be imagined as obvious functions or operations of artificial intelligence. It's worth pausing occasionally to ask what kinds of utterance can and can't be imagined in the context of artificial intelligence. In what circumstances would an artificial intelligence unit say, for example, "You've let me down. That tastes good. Am I going to die, doctor? I'll die if I can't have you. Mummy, kiss it better. I've let myself down. Cheers. Amen." We can imagine artificial intelligence units programmed to say these things in certain circumstances. My question is whether we can imagine a culture of artificial intelligences in which such exchanges were possible or imaginable. I leave that as a question because the advances in artificial intelligence at the moment are so dramatic and rapid that anything that a total ignoramus like myself says on the subject will almost immediately be contradicted by somebody who really knows something about the subject. I speak from experience here. But I put those as questions which I think are worth discussing. And they're questions which have sometimes been focused, you'll see why I mention this in a moment, in the form of asking oneself, what sort of a question would reveal to you, as a human speaker, that another putative speaker was actually an artificial intelligence rather than an organic human being? At least some of the statements I've mentioned there might perhaps prompt such uncertainty about your fellow speaker. and I'd be interested to hear what others think of that and the validity and worth or weight of that as a test. So far then, what I've sought to do is to spell out, rather laboriously, some aspects of that very immediately recognizable human activity that is representation, gesturing, making noises, pointing in a shared environment, which suggest that a simple account in routine cause and effect terms would be adequate to what we're seeing. I've suggested also that those aspects of feedback, what I call gratuity, that is going beyond what is immediately needed to produce a result, are distinctive aspects of representation. And that at both ends of the spectrum, that is the rest of the organic world and the non-organic world, there are reasons for thinking that there are certain things which organic proximity, mutual organic recognizability among humans make distinctive to human identity rather than anything else. But what about the other meaning of human identity? The sense of agency, the sense of a distinctive history, shaping who we are and what we are. What about myself as subject, my identity in a scientific world? I'm not even a bus, I'm a tram, as the limerick says. What does it mean for a speaker to say, my speech is an effect of causes I may or may not understand, but it is what it is, not because of any decision or any cultural environment, but because of a plain set of material interactions. Once again, I'm inclined to come at this question, so to speak, sideways. I spoke earlier of the way in which our representational practices evoke and create a shared world. It's not simply that I call out to another human presence in the environment, inviting a shared act of recognition. In all kinds of circumstances, I call out also to invite help with my own act of recognition. From where I stand, there's a limit to what I can see. To build up the very notion of an object or an environment is, it seems, a cooperative venture. I need there to be somebody else around in order to understand that the world I inhabit is the way it is. And that sense of the cooperative in our knowledge and our mapping of the world seems to me, perhaps rather strangely at first sight, to impose on us a very strong affirmation of the significance of any and every organic point of view, or to use a phrase beloved of a German theologian, a German philosopher 100 years ago, every zero point of orientation. The kind of phrase you might expect from a German philosopher of 100 years ago. That is, every point matters for triangulating and constructing a world that we recognize as objective in the sense that it doesn't depend simply on where I stand for its understanding or its imagining. Somebody else can see round the back. Somebody else sees from another angle. And the construction of an object and an environment is, in that sense, a cooperative venture in which the enormous diversity of ways in which things can be looked at is intrinsic to my own act of representing, speaking, and so forth. I never speak from that zero point of orientation, alone, with no conditioning, with no learning, with no triangulation, as I put it. And that's the point at which it seems to me we can understand something of the meaning or the value of human identity in the sense of personal identity or individual identity. The confluence of points of view, ways of seeing, different 0 points of orientation, is bound up with the very act of constructing an intelligible environment. In principle, no point of view is dispensable. And once this has been granted, I'd want to say a little bit in parentheses, but I think it's a significant point, that we are also opened up to the nagging possibility that the point of view of other organic presences in the world than the human ones is significant. We're not engaged in conversation with those other organic presences in the way we are with other human presences. Yet to say that the world is only known by the confluence of points of view, of perspectives, is to grant a couple of important things. One being that the human point of view corporately is not going to be the last word. And the other being that, therefore, whatever human perspectives are constructed on the environment will necessarily be incomplete in significant ways. We cannot interrogate the chimpanzee or the wombat about their perception or experience or negotiation of the physical environment. But the more seriously we take this dimension of human identity, the more seriously we might entertain the thought that there are things that can be known, felt, negotiated, not accessible to us, systematically not accessible to us, but by that inaccessibility, simply reminding us that we have not fully captured the environment we're in. And you won't really need me to remind you of the importance in the world as it currently is of a degree of both practical and epistemic humility on the part of human beings who have so blithely assumed for so many generations that the human perspective is the only one with moral worth or significance. This is not designed as a reflection on ecological ethics, but I think you can see where there could be some ecological consequences to be drawn out here. So in fact, the response to the two anxieties I began with, the anxiety about the distinctiveness of the human as human, and the distinctiveness of you and me as agents with a perspective, these anxieties can be to some degree met or reframed if we understand and continue to explore that collaborative dimension in our gesturing and our noise-making in constructing a shared environment. What that says about human freedom, for example, or human consciousness, is matter for another and a longer and possibly an even more inconclusive discussion. But in allowing that my own gesturing with its dimensions of feedback, discovery, extension and gratuity, in affirming that that is necessarily bound up with other people's practice of the same things, I'm at the very least saying there are things that I do for myself which I cannot simply sum up in exhaustive third-person terms because I require to be spoken to and to be heard in order to continue to refine what I'm saying. I'm sorry, that needs a little bit of glossing and footnoting, but that's, I think, where we can at least say that my utterance of myself, my speaking out of my context, my history, and the rest, is not simply reducible to a third-person description, which is in principle repeatable for any subject in those circumstances. In short, I'd say that human identity in a scientific world has something to do with the human practice of imagining a world, by which I don't mean imaginary worlds like Narnia or Middle-earth. I mean the imagination with which we approach the environment we're in. The imaginative risk that we undertake when we assume that another organic presence will recognize, understand, and resonate. The imaginative courage we exhibit when we project a possible structure in which puzzling phenomena will fall into place. The imaginative freedom we seem to exhibit when the feedback, as I've described it, pushes us to new noises, new gestures, new configurations and connections in the environment we're in. Which is where, once again, we come back to the actual practice of the scientific world. The assumption so often is that a phrase like the scientific world tells us straight away a story of an impersonal, fairly definitive mode of engaging with our environment, which essentially seeks to reduce causal processes to their minimal structures. And while methodological reductionism, that is, bracketing out certain levels or dimensions of reality for practical purposes of research, is inescapable and unproblematic, the pervasive notion that there is, after all, one way of description, which is the bottom line, is one that's quite hard to maintain in the face of the actual practice of the sciences. Not to mention the fact that scientific advance frequently, embarrassingly frequently, proceeds by intuition and risk rather than simple conclusion drawing. The scientific world, so often and so misleadingly represented in the crude, closed way I've just caricatured, is a world in which imaginative advance is the story of discovery. A structure is proposed or projected. It's tested for its comprehensiveness and its flexibility. If it proves itself comprehensive and flexible, its application to a set of phenomena will itself, just like language in general, generate new questions and new problems. The scientific enterprise is a practice, a linguistic practice, with many of the features that language in general exhibits of incompletion, risk, construction on the basis of inadequate but suggestive premises, and all the rest of it. And I would argue that if we're talking about living in a scientific world and reflecting on human identity in the scientific world, we should perhaps have a richer and a more nuanced sense of what a scientific world actually is. If, as I guess most of us in this hall might agree, the conflict between science and religion is a cardinal case of a phony war, then it's no good apologists on either side, working with the caricatures that are so frequent. And those caricatures are felt by humanist scholars and religious apologists, just as they are by certain kinds of scientistic fundamentalists. So in responding to the questions I've set at the beginning of this lecture, I would want to come back, strange as it may sound, to an affirmation that it is the very scientific world which is supposed to put human identity in question that will in fact deliver us from some of the anxieties which the phony war generates. And moving to my conclusion, such as it is, I would want to argue, as I have once or twice in the last few years in various places, that there is something about the innate cooperative character of human language and understanding, and something about the innately incomplete character of human language and understanding, that at the very least leaves open the kind of theological questioning space that people like me habitually inhabit. In my reflections with you this evening, I've been very conscious of playing away from home in many ways. But I like to think that the theologian concerned to play away from home and interested in doing so will come back to the practice of theology with some fresh insight and fresh energy. I believe, in fact, that what the scientific world has displayed to us, in some of the ways I've outlined, of the nature of human interaction, human speech, human culture, and human awareness, enhances rather than diminishes a sense of what people like myself have been saying for the last couple of millennia about the human in the face of its ultimate source and meaning, that is, the divine. Using science as a kind of building block for apologetics doesn't have a particularly reputable history for all kinds of very good reasons. And I'm not suggesting that we revert to all the various dead ends that has led us to. But if the notion of imagination is somewhere near the heart of this kind of reflection, then I would hope that a theologian might be grateful for the imaginative stimulus provided by the scientific world, which in some people's eyes appears so threatening. The human identity that we can begin to discern when we allow a wide range of scientific questions to come into play in thinking about it is not, after all, our enemy. It becomes so only when the theologian expects a set of deliverances from the scientific world simply reinforcing what she or he has to say. It becomes problematic when the scientist works on the assumption that there is only one kind of stuff, and that stuff is simply stuff, that is passive. The world of the sciences at the moment gives us any number of ways of thinking of the activity, the interactivity, the exchange of information and intelligence that is, in fact, part of stuff. And I'd be much easier, in my mind, in saying that there is no such thing as stuff. The world we know is not, in fact, a world of passive material grazed over its surface by human consciousnesses, but a world in which the constant, consistent exchange of information and the feedback that entails, a world which generates the peculiar thing that is our linguistic being, that world is, in fact, a world in which, insofar as intelligence seems to pervade in every respect, once again leaves us, not with an apologetic argument, but an enhancement and a fresh perspective on the task that theologians undertake. But having now played away from home for some 3/4 of an hour or so, I feel it's time to retreat rapidly in a cloud of dust to my theological home territory, and hope that my reflections on these wider questions haven't been too painfully naive to prevent intelligent questioning from this audience. Thank you.
I think that last comment was an invitation for us to ask questions. of Rowan Williams, which I now invite. There are a couple of microphones. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, do please use those. For those in the Lightfoot room, I think you'll have to come through to here, won't you, to use the microphone, so do feel free to do that. There's one at the side here, and there are just a few extra seats as well. So thank you very much for that lecture. Can I invite anybody who wants to make a comment or a question to go ahead? So there's one just here on this side to start.
Thank you very much for that very helpful and thought-provoking lecture. I hope you'll forgive me if I ask a question which is definitely in the area which you've addressed, but it's a tricky one, and I don't expect a quick, an altogether, full answer. It's the thought about there's a current tension, very much a live issue now, about human identity, and in particularly sexual identity, but it could be in other areas. And the point I want to just raise and invite a reflection or brief reflection would be, to what extent are we each able to just assert how we see ourselves and ask that others simply take that and that's how they ought to see us? Or to what extent is even such very personal things as our very identity and who we are also somewhat of a collaborative thing? And we need to understand that more. And our culture has maybe slightly lost sight of that. Anyway, this is a very thorny, difficult issue, and I hope you don't mind my asking.
Not a bit. That's a really significant and very important question. Thank you. And as you predicted, I don't have a quick answer to it. But let me just throw one or two reflections at it and invite further thought. One is that I suppose the general movement which claims so very vocally that we have a right or a liberty to say who we are in the world, including in the area of gender identity, for example, is in large part a reaction to the experience of being told very firmly by an authority who we are. And the feeling that my identity is therefore simply circumscribed, defined by someone who has no sense of what it is to be me, is as little collaborative as the plain affirmation that it's all up to me. So it's not surprising that if, for example, people who are in various ways engaged in the transitional transgender experience, not at all surprising if there is so strong and sometimes so unnuanced an affirmation, I am what I say I am, if that appears to be overdrawn in the face of an experience of deep frustration by those who have not listened or engaged with what their actual experience is. So I think we're probably in for quite a period of confusion about this. Confusion as to where the boundary lies between what's given and what's culturally constructed. Ever since gender issues began to become problematic for Western thought in recent decades, this question has been there. The question of whether the female identity is cultural, biological, where you start with that question, and now the question of the transgender experience. From what little I know of that, it does seem to me that those who have articulated their position in that context, those who have transitioned, those who are arguing for their own freedom to transition, have been through a sufficiently complex experience, most of them, for it not just to be a matter of what I choose to say about myself. And it's somewhat trivialized if we think that the whole transgender thing is just a lot of people saying, well, I'm whatever I want to call myself. It's a good deal more than that. But where the boundaries lie, I don't know. So all I'm saying really, I think, is that we're looking at a sort of corrective moment where an inability to listen to the distinctive experiences has made for a slightly, as I said, unnuanced reaction. We don't have very clear guidelines about this, but I would agree, finally, that it's it's extremely risky if we end up simply saying everyone's individual will is the only thing that matters in this. And your stress on the collaborative here is important, quite clearly. And very often, as I hinted, the person transitioning is somebody who believes that they have experienced nothing of cooperation, listening, or mutuality in what they've been through. So, as you say, not a simple one, and I'm rambling on. I'll stop.
Thank you. Over at the front here. Yes,
sorry,
the person behind you, and it'll come to you next. Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick one here. Rowan, I'm fascinated by one thing you said, where perhaps you weren't playing quite as far away from home as maybe you thought you were. Scientific enterprise is a linguistic practice. You said, indeed it is, but it may be more than that. So I'd just like to ask if you have something to say about when language runs out, both in theology and in science. It's always struck me that we both share both the aspects of the linguistic practice which you did outline and the sort of apophatic experience of the scientific imagination, which goes, there are things beyond language. Is language enough, or does it run out?
Thank you. That's, again, an extremely important observation, I think. The short answer is yes, that the linguistic practice is one which has, as part of its practice, the moment of saying intelligently and carefully and precisely, this is where we cannot frame an intelligent question any longer. This is the kind of question for which we don't know what would count as an answer. And that, I think that's a moment in scientific study as much as in theology. And while I could ramble on at length about apophatic theology and what it does and doesn't mean, I think very often it's not simply a matter of shrugging one's shoulders and saying in mystical tones, well, it's all very mysterious. It's a matter of saying, we've got to the point where we can no longer frame a question that makes sense. So the point at which, as a theologian, you might find yourself tempted to speculate about the domestic life of the Holy Trinity is the point at which you have to say rather firmly, there is no way of framing an intelligible question about this. Not that it's all very mysterious, but we can't even get the question straight. It's not the kind of thing for which we could. And clearly that's an experience which scientists in various disciplines share.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I just wanted to put a little bit of pressure, I hope it's friendly pressure, on the sort of central idea in the first part of the talk that in the business of representing our shared environment, we find something which is more or less distinctive of the kinds of animals that we are. And I want to put pressure in two different directions. One is that I think that we can find practices which have a lot, if not all, of the features that you identified as distinctive of this business of representing our shared environment in non-linguistic forms. And what I'm thinking of is the sort of shared experience of play, for example, in the form that we can observe it in young animals.
Absolutely, yes.
Think of the cubs sort of in some species where there are many siblings. Now, it's clear that that's cooperative, it's open-ended, it generates its own agenda, and so on and so on. So that puts a little bit of pressure on the idea that there's any kind of sharp boundary between humans and other animals there. Then coming to the other side, and here again the notion of a game provides one way of putting the point. You mentioned Wittgenstein at one point. Now, one of the ideas that, of course, we get from Wittgenstein is that the idea that language is just this sort of univocal business of representing the environment is grossly misleading. You look under the surface a bit, and there are many different language games, as Wittgenstein puts it. And so that, too, I think, puts a little bit of pressure on the idea that there's this distinctive thing that we humans go in for, representing our environment. Now, it's true that it doesn't in itself put pressure on the idea that there's something distinctive about language, and so certainly the claim that language is a distinctively human accomplishment isn't sort of challenged by this idea. but it does require a more nuanced view of what the accomplishment amounts to.
Thank you. Yes, I really don't think I disagree with very much of that at all. Certainly play as a form of learning, and therefore as a form of acquiring shared ways of what I call coping with the environment or negotiating the environment, is not distinct with humans. It's a kind of paralinguistic thing. It's about communication. It's about making intelligible shapes of some sort, because play isn't just shapeless, and we recognize something as play strangely when we recognize a rationale to it in some ways. So again, I'd say I don't want to dig a huge ditch between the human and the non-human experience here, but I would want to come back to this question of the point at which and the way in which what I call the feedback becomes significant in the evolution of language or of play. As for Wittgenstein, well, again, we could be here all night on Wittgenstein, but I think I'd pray Wittgenstein a little bit in aid on my side here, in this sense that, of course, he moves away decisively from the idea that there is atomistic correspondence, that language as a system of representation is simply, there's a thing, we stick the label on it. When you've got all the states of affairs coordinated, then you've said all there is to be said. And what moves him on from there is, I suppose, the growing radical awareness that the way in which we interact with our environment is sometimes representational in a supposedly simple sense, not in practice. It's also to do with expressing certain commonalities, certain actual habits of action that we're involved in. It's to do with the conditions of recognizability between the noises we make. It's to do with a whole range of things, far more than just that early representational thing. So to start with talking about representational practice is not where I'd want to stop in talking about human language by any manner of means. Famously, of course, Wittgenstein is said to have had his great revelation about how he needed to change his mind about language when an Italian colleague made a Neapolitan obscene gesture to him and said, "What is the logical form of that?"
Right next to you.
Thank you very much. When we were lucky enough to hear you speak at the Moral Sciences Club, I'm like you, I'm a philosopher, and you spoke about empathy, and I'd like to connect your borderline environmental message with your views about empathy, which I found very, very interesting, and also picking up the first part of Hugh Price's question. Yes, when we try and understand other animals, we can see the play and we can see the communication, and maybe even in some cases we can see something like culture. Mm-hmm. But then there are moments when our imagination fails. And it's very important that we don't valorize imagination so much that we make imagination be the arbiter for the scope of our moral responsibilities. And for me, that was an important message of your work on empathy.
Indeed.
Our moral obligations so far transcend what we can possibly imagine, that we shouldn't just think, okay, the bits that are like our culture, the bits that are like communication, that's a bit like us. No, there's whole, I know we're not going to get into if a lion could speak, we wouldn't understand him, but the responsibilities to the wider creatures, but then that makes me think, so this is connecting with the imagination theme, but also then the why human identity theme. Why don't we just end up thinking, okay, we are all in this together. Yes. Why do we want there to be a human identity? Thanks.
Thank you very much. To that last question, there are different ways, aren't there, of phrasing the why should we be interested about human identity. One is perhaps a mode in which that question can sound panicky. We're losing our status, we're losing our specialness. And I'm not particularly interested in that in the overall context. I'm more interested in the risks of a reconfiguration of talking about human identity which seems to persuade us to ignore rather a lot of what we actually do as human beings. And that's, I suppose, my concern. On the empathy question, thank you for remembering the talk. Well, but thank you. Yes, I'm tempted to connect this also with John's earlier apophatic point. There are points where imagination fails, and it's very important that it does fail, and it's very important that we recognize that the failure of our imagination, of another point of view, is not an alibi, so can't get around that, but on the contrary, something which, as it were, says to me, so your confidence about your stance, your need, your agenda is radically put in question at that point. And that's where imagination, as it were, turns on itself and says, now you have to imagine yourself very differently because of your failure to imagine fully the other and understand that your connection with or your obligation to the other is not dependent on successfully imagining yourself inside them. Recognition, I'd still want to hang on to as a fairly fundamental thing there, but a recognition which doesn't simply arise from, oh, this is rather like me, but from a strong, fundamental commitment to the idea that we share the challenges of an environment, we share the data of an environment, and move morally from there. Lots more to be said, but I think it's helpful.
Lizzie, right at the back, I think is the next hand I see. And then we'll come forward. 5 rows.
Sir, it seems to me this is a question of human being, of free will, this incredible power of thinking processes and decision making. And this is very important, how we govern our human intelligence and scientific intelligence on slightly modified processing, rationalize and synthesize all information. Is that a question of free will?
I'm not quite sure if I've got the question. I'm so sorry. Could you?
I think being a human being means that you have free will, this incredible power for thinking processes and decision making. And that's in scientific world as well. Is that right?
I think quite clearly that the capacity of human beings to, if I can use the word again, imagine a world and go on extending that imagining in such a way that our decision-making becomes more complex, more adventurous, that is something which is the human blessing and the human curse, you might say.
Thank you. My gratitude as well for a stimulating evening, as the previous questions have noted. I wanted to follow on from what the first gentleman said about the crisis of personal identity. Mm-hmm. He mentioned that identity in a sexual or gender-based context. And I don't know if this reflects anybody else's experiences, but personally I think there's an occupational crisis of identity as well, in that I would certainly say we're all driven or determined by some form of purpose, a need to contribute. Certainly my generation has an issue with their search for purpose and their want of impact. And there was once upon a time when you were asked, what do you do? Which is a question I absolutely dread. You could answer that. You could say, I'm a theologian, I'm a lawyer, I'm a baker, candlestick maker, whatever the aphorism was. And I fear that as roles and almost job titles have become more diffuse, our ability to determine what our impacts and purpose is equally diffuse. So to what extent do you think that human exceptionalism, or what makes us human, is driven by our need to define and understand and have some form of purpose and impact within our society?
It's a very good point, I think, about what you call occupational identity. And it's undoubtedly the case that the culture we're in both valorizes what we do and denies us the opportunity of satisfactorily doing things in all sorts of ways. Which is why I think we need to go a bit deeper and ask about the broader relational anchorage that allows us to make sense. What is it that assures us we are listened to, we are seen, we are engaged with? To put it very crudely, what helps us believe we're taken seriously? And if the grounds for being taken seriously are prescribed narrowly in terms of our function, our output, and so forth, we're in trouble. And I believe that that is part of the trouble we're in, culturally, in general. And that's where my own religious perspective on this comes in to some extent, because, of course, the ground for me of being taken seriously is that my worth depends on being a product of the will of God rather than anything else, and that the value of any other person or any other element in the universe is that it's the product of the will of God. Therefore, its worth is quite independent of what it does for me or what it does for anybody. It's just there, it's a given. And while not everybody who would take that ethical view would start from the same religious place, I think that's a place we need to reaffirm. And it's not unconnected with the idea that, as I outlined in my talk, every perspective has something potentially contributory to where I am and what I am. My perspective has something contributory to others. Its worth is in that general capacity to create, maintain relatedness, connectedness, recognition, not in the measurable output and the good answer to the question, what you do, that is so seductive. So a big set of issues there.
Next row forward, and then we'll come 2 rows further forward, and then I think we'll have to draw stumps.
Thank you so much for a very lovely talk. In science, as I understand it, the scientist can to some extent frame the kind of experimental tool that he or she has in order to find the answer. And depending on what sort of tool and what sort of experiment you've got, you get different sorts of answers. But you can devise new tools. You can devise a new branch of mathematics. You can devise a new category of material. You can make some amazing CERN thing, which ends up finding, in quotes, discovering something which you never could have discovered if you hadn't got that sensory approach. And it seems to me that humans have got 5 senses and their discursive reasoning, and that hasn't changed since time began. And the scientific world is moving so rapidly that the human is falling behind. And they cannot grasp the sort of things that are being said in the science. Well, they haven't got the flexibility. So that some people, for example, can't tell the difference between themselves as themselves and themselves on social media. They don't know the difference. And it seemed to me that if new ways of grasping this collaborative investigation into the world as it is, as you've described, it may require a new approach to our sensory apparatus. And I'm thinking of, deliberately in religion we are taught to play down our discursive mind in order to let the intuitive mind come up. We're taught to play down discursive reasoning. And maybe we need to teach, as a matter of priority in schools, less rigorous logic and rational thinking and facts, objective facts. And we need to teach social intelligence, empathy, emotional intelligence, in order that humans can move at the pace which technology now is?
Goodness, that's a really fascinating, far-reaching thing. I'd like time to think about it, but if you want an unthought response, it would be along these lines. Scientific rationality, as we normally understand it, does indeed move very rapidly by the devising of new tools responding to new questions. Human intelligence overall sometimes moves quite briskly, but moves not so much in the augmenting or extension of questions with factual answers or operational answers, but in ways of configuring, ways of, again, imagining human situations, human possibilities. And that's where I do believe that education needs very urgently to understand both of those kinds of extension of our knowledge as equally extensions of knowledge. It's not that there's one sort of soggy bit of our learning or thinking which is to do with humanities and all that, and there's a tough and effective bit of thinking which is scientific. Ian McGilchrist, of course, on the two hemispheres of the brain. It's that sophisticated, resilient, robust, genuinely extending knowledge happens in the humanities as in the sciences. A balanced education weighs seriously both of those and assumes, as you rightly say, that education should be about the encouragement of that intuitive, global, large picture rather than problem-solving mind as well as everything else. So yes to that, very definitely. But I'd love to think more about it.
Thank you. So we'll take our last question now. Thank you.
I was very struck by a distinction you drew at the beginning of your talk between the description of human as mechanism and the description of human as subject or agent. And I'm wondering if you think it's helpful to think of those as hierarchical. In other words, that description of human as agent or subject actually depends on a description of human as mechanism.
Interesting way of putting it. I think if there's truth in both of those accounts, then something like that would probably have to be said. And what comes to my mind there is one or two of the less known discussions of some issues around humanity in the Greek fathers, say, where Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century rather surprisingly says that the human mind supervenes upon the material and animal workings of an organism. It's not that there are two different things involved, but there is an animal story to be told, which is finally, as it were, rounded off by the conviction that this particular organism, in its relation to God and to others, does more than a mere mechanism would do, or operates in ways that are not simply those of a mechanism alone. So you don't have to, I don't think you have to suspend cause and effect, you don't have to suppose ghosts in machines. But you can at least talk a little bit about that extremely controverted and difficult thing called emergence. And having trailed my coat rather dramatically there, I'm quite relieved that's the last question, because that would be another long discussion. But I don't think I'd quarrel deeply with that notion. I think when we use words like hierarchy in that context, we are saying, aren't we something like the operation of what we call a human agent is more than the sum of the parts as we would describe them in a sort of timeless or abstract or simply physical way.
Good, thank you so much. There are refreshments downstairs now to which everyone is invited, and I can announce that the equivalent lecture next term will be by David Wilkinson, Reverend Professor David Wilkinson, who's with us today. But he's got such a busy diary, he hasn't given us a date yet. So he will no doubt do that soon, and we'll put it on the website. Thank you. It remains to me to thank Rowan Williams again on a Friday evening after an incredibly busy week he was telling me about. We've worked him very hard, so let's thank him again.